Alright, so I was doing a little study on the history of the pre-tribulation rapture perspective taught by most dispensationalists. And doing a history, I went to go look back and see what the early church fathers taught on the subject. And it was interesting that the early church fathers didn't even teach a pre-tribulation rapture. When it first came about, the term was used by Philip Doddridge in 1738, and it was used by John Gill in 1748. The concept of the pre-tribulation rapture was expressed by a Baptist named Morgan Edwards, and he really articulated this concept, this doctrine. Now, John Darby first projected a pre-tribulation rapture doctrine in 1827. So, I mean, looking at these years, it wasn't until the 1700s that this doctrine was even taught or expressed by any theologian. Some people have tried to prove that the church fathers, or some of the church fathers, actually taught a pre-tribulation rapture. And they get this from church father Ephraim the Syrian, and they pulled one of his sermons, and I mean, you look at it and they're just grabbing whatever straws that they can to try to prove that it's a historical doctrine. Now, me myself, I'm a dispensationalist, and I've always believed in a pre-tribulation rapture, but more and more as we see these last days approaching, and I've seen it in talking with people, I think a lot of people nowadays are really moving away from the pre-tribulation rapture perspective. One of the interesting things is you look in Matthew, and when the disciples asked Jesus what was going to happen in the last days in the end time, and Jesus starts talking about birth pains and these various earthquakes and the love of many growing cold and pestilence, and all this stuff. And he told the disciples, you guys are going to have to die for your faith. And of course, what he was applying that to is the church that was around during that age. So just thinking about it, if the church is around during that age, that's the way Jesus presented it. It said that they're going to have to die for their faith. And the concept of a pre-tribulation rapture pulls people out of what Jesus prophesied. It pulls the church out of what Jesus prophesied. Jesus prophesied that the church would have to die for their faith. Yet the concept of pre-tribulation rapture denies that fact. And one of the main reasons for holding to a pre-tribulation rapture is that the Bible teaches that God's children aren't made for his wrath. We're here for tribulation. Of course, we go through the sanctification process, being refined, and but we're not made for God's wrath, which means the bowls that he pours out, the trumpets and whatnot. But that's actually counteracted by the idea that God can bring us through the fire. If we go back to the book of Daniel and how they were saved, they were in the fire, but God protected them through it. And I think that paints a perfect picture there. And then you go to 1 Thessalonians 4:17, and you look at that, and if you want to take the context of the letter, the Thessalonians were kind of wondering what happens, what happened to those who have already died, and they're asking about the last days. Namely, there's a lot about the second coming in there. So you take that in context, and if you read 1 Thessalonians in the context of the second coming, because we all know that in the second coming there's a trumpet, and that's what it talks about in 1 Thessalonians 4. And Christ is coming back, and what it seems to say is that we're caught up with him as he's coming back, and we come down as he's coming down. Not necessarily the idea that we're caught up with him, then we go away somewhere, and then we come back. That's not taught from that scriptures, but it says he's coming back, and we go and we're caught up and we're raptured with him when he's coming back in his second coming. So those are kind of my thoughts on the tribulation and the rapture. I've always been a pre-tribulation dispensationalist, but I mean, looking at all these things in context, and honestly looking at the scriptures, I'm not a pre-tribulation. I don't believe in the pre-tribulation doctrine just because my church teaches it. But I just look to the scriptures and see what the scriptures had to say, and I go with whatever the Word of God says, and honestly looking at it in context and hermeneutics. And in doing that, and you look at 1 Thessalonians, it's talking about the second coming. It's not as though the author stops and then throws in some new concept and then goes back to what he's talking about. But in the context, he's talking about what happens in the second coming, and the dead rise, and we're caught up with him, and then we come back with him, and we rule and reign with Christ, which would fit 1 Thessalonians. Which would fit Revelations, because Revelations talks about the church coming back with Christ, and that makes perfect sense if we're caught up with him right before he actually comes back. So we meet him in the air on his way back, and then he steps foot, and that's the end. Well, that's the millennial. God bless.